Welcome to The Main Thing. I'm your host, Noah Cracknell. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Main Thing. Today, my guest is Louis Shulman. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, to start off, I figured we'd kind of give a little bit of context for the listeners, who you are, what you do, and I'm just kind of curious where you're from and how did you end up at University of Alabama?
Yeah, so my name's Louis Shulman, currently professionally working for a company called Inflection Points. We do corporate trainings for companies that hire a bunch of new employees and need them to be up to date on crypto and all things involved in Bitcoin, etc. We also offer that as a retail program. Then we have a job board, right, that kind of help companies fill those open roles and help people interested in working in the industry find those open roles. So I started there in January, and I've been their director of growth, so essentially the first external marketing hire. And kind of some demographics, right? So I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada, which is where I am right now. Grew up here, born and raised my whole life. And then I decided to go to the University of Alabama for college, mainly because at the time I was applying, and I haven't checked, to see how things are at this point in time, but around the time I was applying, the University of Alabama's scholarship policy was 100% objective, right? So a lot of schools are kind of ambiguous. You write an essay, you tell your story, you know, tell them your favorite color and your favorite number, and if they like it and they have the same favorite color number and like your story, then you might get money or might not. Whereas the University of Alabama was 100% just a matrix, right? It's like if you got this on your SATs or ACTs, and if you got this on your GPA, this is how much money you're going to get. And I went into the application process saying, well, I like that offer of what I would hypothetically get should they just stay true to their matrix, which they did. And if I win the lottery somewhere else, that'd be great. But if not, I have this as an option. And kind of when everything was said and done at the end of the kind of April, right, of my senior year of high school, and everyone's making those decisions, it was by far the best option. And went for a tour and decided that, if I wasn't like the school top of mind for me, right, being from Las Vegas, I'm not like a crazy big sports fan or anything, which is a big draw for a lot of people to Alabama because the football team's so incredible. But I just thought to myself and kind of discussed with my parents, well, I'll go there for a year for free because it seems fun. And if I don't like it, I'll go somewhere else. Yeah, so I kind of had thought it through with my family that I was like, well, I don't know if this was the school that was top of mind for me, kind of given my background and everything and interests, whatever else. But I might as well go there for a year because it seems fun. It's a beautiful campus. The price is right. And if I don't like it, I'll have accumulated a year of credit for free. And if not, and if I do like it, I'll just stay and that'll work out and that'll be great. And that's kind of what ended up happening.
Nice. And what were some other schools that you were applying to during that senior year, junior year in high school?
Yeah, so I was all over the place geographically. You mentioned you're from kind of California, is very interested into USC. Really great school, super close to home. My sister went there. That was one school I was super into. I liked Emory. I did high school speech and debate pretty competitively, and so I was looking at a lot of schools that had competitive collegiate debate, specifically like the type I did, because most schools have some sort of program, but I wanted to do the same kind. And USC, Emory, Wake Forest, those are three really strong schools for debate programs. Applied to a couple of the Ivy Leagues as well, and then kind of just a couple other miscellaneous random ones.
Yeah.
But
did the what did the debate competition look like? What were you debating on? Was it like a mock trial type of situation, or how did that look in high school?
So the type of debate I did was called policy debate, which is essentially debating certain policy resolutions. So every year there'd be one really broad topic. Like one year it would be that the United States should cut back its domestic surveillance. And then you would debate intricate proposals related to that. So someone would propose, well, we should do it, and here's a specific example of a way we should do that, right? Let's break up the tech companies, or let's make it so the government's not allowed to have backdoors into social media data. Or someone would debate the opposite side. It's like, well, actually, terrorism's like a real thing, believe it or not, and maybe it's important that we have those backdoors. One year would be like exploration of the oceans, right? There's some environmental concerns of like, well, there's a lot of, like the oceans are like 2% explored or something. So it's like there's a lot of stuff we're going to find that's probably useful. And then there's a lot of counter arguments as well. So I did that style, and it was like usually about a 90-minute conversation with a partner, you and a partner against another person and a partner, like a series of 8-minute and 5-minute speeches with some live Q&A as well.
Did you feel, or, bouncing forward a little bit, and then we'll come back to this point, do you think that desire for competition and debate shaped in any form your interest in cryptocurrency or the podcasting at all?
Yeah, I'm not especially combative on podcasts and in crypto. I think one thing that structured debate taught me is that
Mm-hmm.
non-structured debate is just not fun, right? It's
Mm.
like
Mm.
structured
Mm-hmm.
debate's really good, right? You have 8 minutes,
Mm.
3 minutes of questions, they get 8 minutes. That's a formula for like an effective conversation. You're not interrupting each
Yeah.
other, right? You have plenty of time. So then I just really don't enjoy like non-structured conversations or debating with people who don't have like experience in structured debate, because then it's just like it's not a intellectual exercise as much as there's a lot of other social dynamics at play. Like there's some like dominance at play, like who's just at a certain point it's just less constructive. I think that debate equipped me to like think better and research better, which
Mm-hmm.
I think, let's say, could have led me to being bullish on crypto faster, because I think a lot of people, what prevents them from getting it is just the amount of time they're willing to spend on research, and that's
Right.
also probably related to the amount of time they've spent in their life competitively doing research, or like doing
Mm-hmm.
research as like a huge structure of like a casual hobby. So like no, because for most people crypto is optional research. Like very few people up until now, and we're starting to see this accelerate, but in the recent history, no one's really needed to understand crypto for their work. So it's like, how good are you at doing casual research for fun? And I think like that's a big indicator of like what leads people to crypto earlier than not. And so I think it was like very informative in, my ability to like see through some of the arguments against Bitcoin and crypto and like be like, okay, these are bad arguments, these are good arguments, and like let me come to terms with accepting it more quickly. And also debate, like specifically the type I did, was very focused. It wasn't like cats versus dogs, right? It was like, the U.S. government policy should, take action on this really substantial thing in this really substantial way. And like I was kind of already having those conversations from a young age, which was very different than like kind of doing more trivial things like this sports team's better than this sports team. And not to say there's nothing to be learned from like those types of debates, but I was already kind of used to doing these really big macro conversations.
Yeah, and I love the way that you put that because as a writer, I write a lot and I write on Medium, my own website, and I view writing almost as a tool to connect ideas together and like
Mm-hmm.
deepen my understanding of a topic. And it sounds like for you, that was in essence what debate was, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that
yeah,
writing, I think you have to either have writing or some public speaking
mm,
to be a constructive thinker, right? Otherwise, your ideas are never tested. So writing is
right.
like the only way you can ever test your ideas with yourself, right? Because most
Hmm.
people just aren't good at talking aloud solo. That's just like really awkward, and people tend to cut themselves some slack. So debating is just like essentially like having to formulate ideas and make them make sense, or you look stupid. And writing
Mm,
is like you have to stare yourself in the face, and like you can't tell yourself this makes sense if it doesn't.
right. On the note of debate, what are maybe I look back at my baseball career and one of the things that I'm like extremely grateful for is that it taught me to deal with failure out in life and in general. Is there anything looking back, specifically maybe on that high school time where you were debating that you learned from and you benefit from today?
Oh, I mean, constantly. I think one, there's on like the subtle side, there's probably so many subtle things I picked up just watching like
Mm,
extremely talented communicators and, let's call them like high charisma people just be, right?
mm,
I think very rarely do we see high charisma people our own age as like young people, right? Like
mm,
we just like the only high charisma people we see are like politicians, celebrities, etc. But when we're young, and then seeing like a 16-year-old who has like this command of like a huge audience and is just like absolutely crushing it, like in just such a big intellect, that's
mm-hmm,
really formative to like see that and be inspired by that and like be like, okay, maybe you can also become that person. Because like, especially when you see kids like over the course of 4 years of the activity, see kids who like weren't that become that. It's like, okay, well,
mm-hmm,
there's clearly something there that's like learnable and repeatable. I think obviously thinking on your feet was a big part of debate, so I did that, right? And the amount of the way that policy, the one I did specifically structured, is one team comes in with a specific idea related to the broader topic, then you have to be prepared to answer that. And there's like a high chance that the one they've proposed is one you've done zero research for and zero preparation for. So you just have to like figure things out. And
right.
that's like hugely positive.
I had a follow-up question to the kind of debate. Is there So when you're practicing in high school, was there anything that you did? What kind of exercises would you do when you were practicing for debate in high school, or just in general now that you still do?
Sure, I think again one of the most important things with debate was like speaking clearly and loudly and like
Hmm.
really just not fumbling words. And I don't do like as good of job now as I did then. But I mean people would do like very, very bizarre exercises like speaking drills is what they'd be called.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a website, it's like Princeton or Stanford. If you just look up like policy debate speaking drills, there'll be a website that just like lists a bunch. But you'd have a document in front of you with just words on it, right? Like probably just your actual speech, and you would do all sorts of things. You'd read it backwards as fast as you can out loud. So that's like focusing on individual words. Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when you're speaking, you're like, actually, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes you just want to like be able to. There are certain things in policy that are very gamey. Like there are certain things that you just have to read very quickly, like as quickly as possible, to the point where it doesn't have to be coherent and you don't have to like pay attention to the context. So like reading
Right.
backwards helps you focus on just reading words without
Mm.
getting distracted by like trying to understand them while you're reading them, which is
Mm-hmm.
counterproductive for other aspects of the game, right? But like that's a
Mm-hmm.
hyper specific thing. Also, just being able to concentrate enough and kind of teaching yourself not to multitask, but maybe multi-process, where you'd be
Mm-hmm.
reading something and then in between every word you'd say and or than. So it's like just again being able to like really add some cognition to what's usually a rote activity. Like reading aloud is just doing that, but trying to read quickly while interrupting each word, right? And then pen and
Yeah.
mouth is a pretty standard one. So you'd put a pen in your mouth like and try to still speak through that and
Oh,
still sound
whoa.
clearly, and that's one. So
I,
those are like a
I've never
few.
heard of that.
Yeah. So that one is pretty effective for like forcing you to find a way to like enunciate without doing that. I'm trying to think
Mm-hmm.
of like other ones. Those are like muscular almost, right? Those are like
Mm-hmm.
physiological drills. And then there's
Right.
all sorts of like cognitive ones where you do,
Right.
give the same speech 5 times over, right? And so because in policy, right, it's not about prepared speeches. It's about like only the first two speeches are essentially prepared of like this whole 90-minute session. Then everything else is
Mm-hmm.
contextualized to earlier in the debate. So what you do is you would do like the first half of the debate, and then just those second half speeches, you would redo them constantly. Like, what's the best possible way I could have done this speech? And you usually feel you're not super efficient right away, so
Mm-hmm.
you have a 5 minutes for it like in real time. But
Mm-hmm.
let's say your first one takes 5 minutes, and it's like, all right, I want you to make all those same arguments again, say everything you just said, but now you only have 4 minutes, and
Mm-hmm.
then try to give that same exact speech, but now in three. It's like, where are you like not being economical with your words? Where are you being redundant? Where are you just spitballing and not really sure what to say next? And those were like some of the drills that like stand out.
Going back to University of Alabama, I was looking on LinkedIn, and I believe your degree is in computer science. Is that
It is.
correct? Okay. Was as we're talking about debate, did you have a background or an interest in computer science before going to Alabama, or did you switch halfway, or what did that whole process look like?
Yeah, so I started out as undeclared engineering,
Okay.
uh, just general engineering school. It's like I want to do something that's science and math heavy because those are like my skills and those are what's in demand. And that's like a whole other debate, like whether or not I think it's worthwhile to go to school for something non-challenge that like doesn't challenge you.
Mm.
That's like, or at least that's like a question. I don't know if that's something I need to like impose on other people, but it's something I imposed on myself.
Mm.
And I did really well in math in high school. Did Yeah, I did well in science too. Science is a bigger category than math, right? Science is like all the branches of science, whereas math is, like, at least in the high school level, more confined in what it covers. But I took no interest in programming in a sophisticated way before college. I never did any self-taught tutorials or like any classes in high school. So I just knew it was an interest, and so I took a intro to computer science class my first semester just as like an exploratory, like, well, this is either going to be a professional elective for any engineering degree, or I'll like
Right.
it and I'll like it and I'll follow through. And I just really liked it right away, and declared. I probably towards the end of the first semester.
Cool. And transitioning now a little bit to maybe crypto specifically, was there a signal that, or what was your signal for investing in crypto and also for becoming a part of the ecosystem of crypto with being employed within the industry?
I think a lot of the signal for me was seeing the macro thesis for, let's like narrow in on Bitcoin at first,
Sure.
seeing all the reasons for it, the reasons people said it was necessary, slowly unraveling in real time,
Mm-hmm.
specifically like in March of 2020. So I understood a lot of like let me like walk it back. There's like a whole saying. I'm gonna kind of butcher this a little bit, but like
Sure.
people we call like prophets and people who see the future are just people who like better understand the present or are willing to just find the present truthfully. And I think that's kind of like what made like I think I like heard that at some point and just like filed it away, right? And then I like encountered this whole Bitcoin thing and like saw the perfect example of that playing out, where people are like,
Mm-hmm.
the government does this thing which is bad. When specifically, let's call it the printing of money. That's a thing that like we think has a lot of negative consequences, and in the future will continue to lead to X, Y, and Z. And then also the transition to a cashless society means the transition to like a more broad surveillance society, which I like didn't even need any context to like immediately grasp that being like both true and necessary to like have some antidotes to. And then so in those things, and then there's like a number of other kind of arguments about like in general, and then just thinking about like how come the internet doesn't have like a native way to transfer value outside of just the kind of traditional old systems, and just like here's an innovative solution that's 10 times better than the current solution in every conceivable way essentially. And which is again an oversimplification, but just for the sake of like kind of telling a story here. But
Mm-hmm.
when I like what really set it off was seeing the money printer in March of 2020 like kick off again, right? That was like enough to like add urgency to everything else. And the like inflation hedge narrative was enough to like really get me invested. And then kind of the, I don't want to call it like building a personality around it or building a brand around it, but just like letting it take over, besides just like there are other pieces of my portfolio that I don't like spend a lot of time talking about or thinking about. Like I didn't go and try to work in the real estate industry, right? But it's like I've got plenty of money invested in a couple of REITs, right? Like I understand the
Right.
utility of having that as a piece of my portfolio, but not enough to like, that's the thing I talk about, that's the thing I make friends with, that's the thing I go to conferences for. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, a lot of that came down to the energy from the type of people in the industry. And
Mm.
I had a hypothesis, right? Like I met through my own podcast, which I've done like roughly 100 episodes of. Maybe 10 to 20 of those have been crypto adjacent, and there's just something very different in the like passion, energy level, curiosity, intellect about like every person you meet who's like hyper interested in this. Especially, this is like the funny thing to say because I'm still relatively new to the industry, but especially like a year or two ago when the adoption curve was like half what it is now, it was like
Right.
even extra self-selecting for like really cool personality traits and like really desirable things for like the type of people I like to spend time with. And what I did is I chose to attend the Bitcoin conference in 2021 right after graduating as a way to like test the hypothesis. Is this just like the influencers on the internet are really cool and interesting, or like are the vast majority of plebs and people who like come to these events interesting, or are they all like weird psycho nerds and like crazy stuff going on, or like whatever. So I just had this
Mm-hmm.
hypothesis that's like I think these are the type of people I want to work with. I think this is the industry I want to go into, and also it's like a very neat combination of like skills and interest, etc. And so then when I went to the conference, I just essentially only had positive experiences with every type of person I met there, young and old, and was like, all right, this let's narrow it down. Also, I was really indecisive in terms of like what I wanted to do after college, like remarkably so. And
Mm-hmm.
crypto was like the only thing that kind of consistently came up, and so adding that as a limiting factor just really, really like I would not have been able to drown out the noise of the otherwise overwhelming like list of options had I not like used that as a way to narrow down what I was looking for.
Right. I love that you know, had an experience with Bitcoin and then tested a hypothesis essentially. I think a lot of people, especially coming directly out of college, and I'm almost to that point, they're almost too afraid to do that. They think they've run out of time in essence, right? Like that there's no longer time to do any sort of that testing. And so I absolutely love that because that's a framework that I take into so many things in life, and it's a super valuable skill to have just in general. My question is, I had a recent conversation with. So I told my mom that I was speaking to you, and I showed her your Twitter account, and she's 50 something years old, and she doesn't really know what cryptocurrency is. And I thought a interesting question would be to pose, if you were to explain cryptocurrency to a person from, a background that is very much not crypto related, what would you say?
Yeah, I had a friend of mine who works for Bitcoin Magazine and like the public policy, and he explained this really, really well, talking about have to find like people come to Bitcoin for like all sorts of different reasons, right? Like I first came from the inflation narrative. A lot of people come from it from like the esoteric, like deep cryptography. This is just the most interesting things happening in cryptography, and that's like what I love is cryptography. Other people come at it from like that. Well, I'm a refugee. And when you try to leave a country, they take all your money, but they can't take your Bitcoin if you have it, blah, 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 blah. And so what you usually try to do is just like find a way to connect it to what that person is most likely to resonate
Mm,
to, instead of just like giving them like the same, the Bitcoin white paper, right? Which is just like,
right.
well, we finally solved the double spend problem. And this blockchain thing is a really cool piece of technology that's invented. Like none of that necessarily needs to come up right away at all. That's just like you don't have to explain to people that the internet is just a series of cables and like explain like like you could choose to like talk about how cool it is that we've invested like you could start explaining the internet to someone by starting to talk about transistors, right? Like that's what the innovation was that led to it, but like that's not super
Right.
relevant. It's like no, you can have a face-to-face phone call with someone and you don't care where they are. Like that's the part that's going to be interesting to them.
Mm,
And so you have to
yeah.
figure out, like, I don't know your mom, I don't know kind of her background, but there's probably some benefit of Bitcoin that's tied to some interest of hers, right? And I think right now, like the inflation one's really salient to a lot of people because it's something we can all see. It's something that we make sense. It's something we're all feeling. So that's something that like
Mm-hmm.
gets an emotional hook right away. I think that,
Mm-hmm.
or like the Ukraine war, like Afghanistan crisis, like any of those are also really easy ways to start to explain it to someone. Just start with like, here's the benefit of it that's really difficult to argue with that you're going to agree with, right? That's
Right.
like, people in Russia or people in Ukraine, all of a sudden, all their life savings of these other countries that decided that they're going to be sanctioned or they're not allowed to leave, or just all these factors way beyond their control have made the fruits of their labor for like their lives up until this point completely up in jeopardy, potentially worthless, etc. What if there was like a way to store the fruits of your labor in just this like global record of account? Like I'll explain the details later, but just like bear with me on like it's possible. Like what if there
Mm-hmm.
was a way that we just stored all of our wealth collectively in like this thing called Bitcoin, and no single government controls it, no blah blah, like no group of people controls it, no government controls it, like, and it's borderless. So if you have to escape a country during a specific period of time, your wealth can come with you relatively unchanged. Like that,
Right.
if that's going to be interesting to them, they're like, okay, well, I'm skeptical that that could actually exist, but like that sounds cool. So let me like now get into the part of the conversation where I decide if I'm going to agree with you that that's possible. But like start
Yeah.
with like this is a consequence that is really useful and really
Mm-hmm.
difficult to say is a bad consequence. And if you can
Yeah.
get someone on board with that, then they're like, okay, now I want to learn more. Instead of just like
Right.
being like, here's everything, do you get it?
Yeah. I think that's a very interesting, perspective to take on that question because I think some people would just say, like one thing, but what you're trying or you're hinting at is like, well, let's question like what in your life derive meaning from, and then we can attach Bitcoin to something in your life that you would benefit from, right? Yeah, which I think is so powerful for explaining it. When cryptocurrency obviously has evolved a lot in the last 10 years, but specifically I'd say since COVID happened, right? Since March of 2020, like you said. The utility behind cryptocurrency has also evolved, and like the utility for some of these, other coins that people are tying utility to the coin. What do you see as the biggest utility possibility in the future? Like what is the highest ceiling for utility of cryptocurrency?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction to be made between like cryptocurrency, blockchain technology in general, etc.
Mm-hmm.
I think that money is still probably the most important use case, and like let's
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of in the camp that's like this is something I've decided is a problem worth solving. I know other people are going to come up with other interesting things to do with this, but like I'm going to mostly stay involved with this until we've kind of won. And then
Mm-hmm.
maybe if I have like spare time or whatever. Like obviously I still partake in like other aspects of the ecosystem, find them fun, find them constructive, find them amusing, find them like are also important. But I'm like let's like see this first one through and then like focus on this other stuff. So I do think that like providing a viable alternative, right? This is not about replacing the existing monetary structure. This isn't about destroying anyone or like making anything obsolete. I mean, which like could be side effects, right? I don't know, but that's not like my focus, right? This is not like combative. This is it would be nice to have this alternative way of doing things where people who want to opt into the system of Bitcoin can like have Bitcoin, use Bitcoin, transact in Bitcoin, and don't need to have any connection to the other system to be like a viable participant in like a big enough economy to sustain themselves, etc. So like
Mm-hmm.
let's see like that fully win. But I think that from like a intellectual exercise or just I think like other things that I think are interesting, I think that there are like this move for cryptography in general is like also a move towards privacy. It's towards censorship resistance. And censorship resistance is not just about speech, right? Like people have added the connotation of censorship to just meaning like speech. So
Right.
people delete your tweet, they delete your YouTube video because they don't like what's in them. But like there's also financial censorship, right? If you donated to a GoFundMe campaign in Canada and Canada didn't like that you donated to that, they can just turn off your bank account and censor your finances, right? With
Mm-hmm.
Bitcoin, like you can't have that. I think that on the flip side, there is also utility to not being able to censor information, to not be able to easily alter like historical records. I think NFTs are kind of interesting ways to like build incentives around different things. And like that's all interesting. I kind of relate it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people do this comparison of like, well, let's compare where we are in cryptocurrency to like the internet in general, like 20 or so years ago. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of at the phase that's like when we created the internet, it was for like communicating with people across distance, and then also like basically having debates over text, right? Like having
Mm-hmm.
building text websites, building like a virtual encyclopedia, just like this information library. That was the use case that like right away it was like, this is what we built it for. It's really good at doing this. Let's see that win. And then a bunch of other people had a bunch of other ideas. Some of them were good, some of them weren't. And like over a
Mm-hmm.
series of like 10 or 15 years, the really good ones, like selling books on the internet, like e-commerce, right? That was a really good idea. That one like survived. And then like distributing entertainment, that one survived. Then like a lot of other ideas just like didn't really take off. And we're kind of at that phase, in my opinion, with like the whole cryptocurrency ecosystem. Is like this was built to solve this problem related to, if you have a decentralized database for money, how do you prevent the same dollars from being spent twice? Like this is what this technology was built for. It solved that problem. Let's like fully realize that. And then a bunch of other people are like, but you could also do this with it. I'm like, go for it.
Mm-hmm.
And like I'm gonna check back in a couple years and like see who was right. But that's
Right.
just a lot to focus on, and I only have so many hours
Yeah.
in the day.
Yeah. I absolutely love the way that you structured the answer, because one of the things that I think people who are newbies to cryptocurrency get wrong is that they take it as a threat almost to, like, their money, the way that they do things. And I think it's more of like an opportunity, like you were saying, and it's not necessarily combating anything, but providing an opportunity for other people to do things with. So maybe digging deeper on that point, if somebody views cryptocurrency as a threat, what would you potentially tell them to, inform them about the possibilities of it, but specifically, like, swayed them in the direction of this is not a combative technology, or it's not, the goal is not to disrupt, the world and cause mass hysteria.
Again, it's very contextual as to where they are, right? If there's someone who
Mm-hmm.
is a stakeholder in a system that dramatically benefits from crypto not winning, right? And plenty of
Mm-hmm.
people disagree with me in Bitcoin. Like plenty of people are
Mm-hmm.
openly hostile. Like I want to create Bitcoin so that the Federal Reserve cannot exist. Like plenty of people have that opinion. And if your friend works for the Federal Reserve, it's like how do you get them on board with that? It's kind of,
Yeah.
I think a lot of the narratives around Bitcoin, like not like this, really profoundly deep student of history, right? But like I've
Mm-hmm.
studied some like history of innovation, and I think a lot of the parallels from like pretty much every major paradigm shift in some like dramatic area of society is like appropriate to draw here. Pretty much all of them, right? So it's like if you're someone who was in the horse buggy business when the automobile came out, it's like how do you tell them that they have to get on board with this thing? It's like they don't have to. Like
Mm-hmm.
they can still do their thing. They can still do that. There's still people who might like really prefer how things are. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
I'd anticipate your demands to decrease over time for these reasons,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd anticipate that the opportunities given to you for catching on sooner rather than later will like be disproportionately better the sooner you catch on. And it's not
Right.
like you don't have to agree with me. I'm just saying like this is how I see things unfolding, and I see like things unfolding negatively for you if you don't change course. But it's all you can do is kind of present them the information. But it's no different than like anyone else who's denied any other technology over time, like people who are super into print media before the internet, right? It's like
Right.
print media still exists. It's just in
Mm-hmm.
less demand, but it still exists.
Right. And then unpacking cryptography. Maybe you could expand on what it is for those that don't know what cryptography is, and then its, use case in crypto.
Hmm. I'm gonna give definitely a bit of a disclaimer and say this is a hand wavy explanation, uh, directionally appropriate, not
Mm-hmm.
fully accurate in the details, but cryptography is
Which is
essentially making
completely fine, by
yeah.
the way.
So just like if people
Completely
like
cool.
if there's some people there's going to be some people listening to this who are smarter than me technically and are going to like point out flaws with what I'm saying, but I think it's just more important for people to grasp the concept of what's happening, But
Mm-hmm.
when you send a text message to someone else through iMessage, right? Like it doesn't just appear on their phone. Like it feels that way because like the lines of communication are invisible. But at a certain point, like some piece of information has to travel over some cell phone wire or through some satellite or just through whatever. Like there's some other device. We're not communicating peer to peer. My phone's not sending something to your phone. It's sending something through something else that gets routed to your phone. If we don't want the people like along the lines to read it, I mean, the easier example is like like in war in history, like there's telegrams that were sent from like one country to another, and if someone
Sure.
intercepted the telegram, they could just read it and know what the other country's plans were, and like that wouldn't be good. So what you would
Mm-hmm.
do is you'd send some version of your message across the lines that was super scrambled, and like this whole random formula was applied to it, so it was unreadable to anyone who didn't have the formula to untangle it. So cryptography is just essentially, I don't know if like the whole discipline of cryptography is essentially this, but the idea of like encryption and decryption is you take a message, you use some random formula or series of steps to scramble it, and then it's essentially impossible to figure out what the unscrambled version is without some secret piece of knowledge or access to the formula or some like variable in an equation that untangles the puzzle. So that's
Right.
like the framework of cryptography. And that's so like the level one explanation is that is what is employed to prevent people from manipulating the Bitcoin network for personal gain.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. And the maybe a last question in the crypto realm, and then we'll maybe transition to Twitter and maybe the podcast a little bit. But I had a I had a friend who he is, I wouldn't say he's a bear on crypto in general, but he doesn't see the utility. And I think your explanation about viewing it as an opportunity as opposed to a threat, he would, be very open to. But he made the argument that he sees crypto as, you know, if he could, what's the difference between investing in cryptocurrency and going and getting really good at poker and gambling all of his money? And I basically didn't have a very good answer the way he explained it, but I would be curious what your answer to that would be, because some people view cryptocurrency such that it's just you're throwing money into this thing. It's you don't know whether it's going to go up or down, which some people would view as like gambling. So how is it not gambling?
Mm-hmm. So a few things I'll say here. One thinker that if anyone finds what I've said interesting, I'd really encourage everyone to check out Alex Gladstein. He is like the chief strategy officer for the Human Rights Foundation, and he wrote a book called Check Your Financial Privilege. And
Mm,
the narrative of that book, or the synopsis, is that people with really robust governments and stable societies for the past 25, 50 years don't catch on to Bitcoin as quickly because they don't need to. Right? The government hasn't done
mm,
anything so awful to them in their finances or anything so unfair or cheating that they don't understand why it's necessary. Whereas if you're in some country where the government makes your money worth half overnight, or makes it so you're no longer allowed to do that overnight, or the government's done something financially pervasive,
mm-hmm,
all of a sudden this narrative makes sense and you're willing to take the risk. So that's like one thing for just why in some countries like the United States, most people who have like had financial privilege, not even saying that you've had a lot of money, right? Just like that the
mm-hmm.
amount of money you've had has been yours, right?
Right.
This is not about the amount. This is just about like the circumstances that the money you made, you're able to keep, and no one was able to mess with it. And
Mm-hmm,
that, like you wanted a bank account, you're able to get a bank account. That is like the big differentiator why a lot of people in these first world countries are very apathetic to Bitcoin right away, whereas
mm,
people in other countries are like, this. I immediately understand why this is necessary. From the speculation financial upside perspective, I think there's a lot of differences. I think that people really need to be precise in their language when like they describe these things, again, to have a constructive conversation. So it's like if your friend was talking about the difference between buying stocks and buying poker, it's like, well, buying stocks is very different than buying Apple stock. Buying stocks is very
right.
different, or buying Apple stock is very different from buying Amazon stock, right? Like
Mm-hmm,
they're subject to the same factors in some respect. A lot of the same people trade stocks, and like there's macro trends, but it's like, Apple does this thing in this industry, and if you think more people are going to want cell phones over time, and you think they're going to buy Apple, then you're placing a bet that that's going to continue to appreciate over a
right.
long enough time. Amazon is like, well, are people going to want to be able to get things at their house quickly, or are they going to want to it's a separate debate. And so when you're talking about buying cryptocurrencies, you have to. It's not fun to like be the guy to explain this to people, but you
Mm-hmm,
have to be like, every single one is different, has its own fundamentals, has its own set of constraints that like could make it blow up or could make it like a terrible idea, and a lot of people just haven't realized that yet.
Right.
So it's every single one has to be debated kind of differently. So it's like the difference between buying Bitcoin and playing poker. Again, so like real quick to answer like the root of the question, the difference between buying any asset and playing poker is that with playing poker, you're making a wager that you're going to get better cards than other people, or that you're better at psychology and manipulation and strategy than other people. And so you're kind of betting on yourself and betting on like the way that the dice roll or the cards flip over, whatever like the metaphor is there. But with crypto or any financial asset that you're purchasing, you're speculating on will the demand for this good increase over time. And your reasons for why you'd speculate on that all depend on each crypto and your beliefs about like how it works, why people would want it, why they wouldn't, or like what could go wrong and how likely those things are to go wrong, or what could go right and how likely those things are to go right.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that explanation. Are there any other resources that you would point people to within, the information of crypto and potentially the newsletter and your show, or any other books or resources there?
Yeah, I think that one of the best ways for people to learn about Bitcoin is to kind of do it on accident if they're just trying to learn about it casually. So like I think there's an argument to be made for like, yeah, go read Alex Gladstein's books, go watch him give some talks on YouTube, etc. Like that's great. I think obviously this is like one of the most generic piece of advice, but it's also one of the most helpful. Is like you can buy as little as $1 of Bitcoin, as little as $5 of Bitcoin, and just going through, and like that's probably not a risky proposition for anyone listening to this to buy like $1 of something. That's just like the choice of guac or no guac, right? Just like one day no guac, buy $1 worth of Bitcoin, and that process will force you to learn quite a lot, just like getting to that outcome. And then what I recommend to people is the book Bitcoin Billionaires by Ben Mesrich, because so he's the same author who wrote The Social Network, the book that was turned into the movie, and he's just a really good author, and it's a good engaging story. And the book is like interesting, right? There's good characters, it's funny, there's like drama, there's action. He's a really good writer, and that's just like a book you would enjoy reading, and then like you'll just accidentally learn a little bit about Bitcoin from reading it, right? So instead of being like, here's this textbook, right, like the Bitcoin Volume 1, this is how Bitcoin was created, like that's kind of interesting, but again, it's not necessary for someone to grasp those technical details right away. Just what's important is to build curiosity. Then if you have the curiosity, you have the endurance to like go through a harder resource later. So start with a book that's like
Sure.
pop nonfiction, right? Just like super easy, fun storytelling with like dramatized characters and money and like all sorts of crazy interesting stuff. Read that with like little sentences about Bitcoin explained, like one out of every 3 pages, and then you'll finish the book with some understanding of it, some understanding of context, and hopefully some curiosity that'll give you endurance to like go then consume some harder resource. But just recommending
Yeah.
to people like the best resource right away is like they're just not going to watch it because it's going to be boring and they don't have motivation to watch it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer and suggestion for people is build curiosity, which will build the endurance to, learn more and more quickly. So I love that. And it applies to so many other things just outside crypto, right? It applies to anything. When you were attending these crypto conferences, these Bitcoin conferences, was that kind of the launching point to getting into the job that you currently are at, or what did that process look like? How did you get to the position you are currently?
So the conferences were very helpful for meeting and connecting with people in person, right? That's a big difference than in person in the DMs. DMs are still helpful. You can go a long way with just DMs and social media interaction, but in person is very helpful. Again, the conferences were where I decided that I'm going to be in this industry, and I think that decision was important for taking the search seriously. And then also, yeah, building a lot of connections that if I like tell the story backwards of like how I got into every role I'm in, like there was a point of contact with every person involved at one of those events, and
Wow.
that's like pretty important. Not every
Right.
single person involved, but it's like had I that everything there were enough crucial pieces in the story that the story would have gone much differently had I not been at those events, if that makes sense.
Totally. And touching on those events, are they events that anyone can go to, you just sign up for on the internet and you attend, or were they
Yeah.
invite specific, or kind of what are some of the main ones?
Yeah, so one of these was, my first job in the industry was at Bitcoin Magazine, which is the company that actually hosts the Bitcoin conference. And a lot of that was just kind of random serendipity. I, met a friend from like a summer internship, and we were talking about this, and that, and I told him I was going to that event, and
Mm.
he's like, "Oh, you should talk to my friend because he's working there," and I was like, "Oh, I actually know him because like he almost joined my fraternity, but then he didn't." But like, so like I knew him like 4 years ago, but like yeah, he was a cool kid. I'll reconnect with him. And
Hmm.
so I went down there and hung out with him, and he was working the event. And then a few weeks later, hung out with him in Nashville because I was like nearby. And then, we became friends. And then later in the summer, this is last year,
Hmm.
and he's like, "Hey, I just got a job with this company from like intern to job, right? I'm gonna
Hmm.
drop out of school and take this job, and I need a roommate if you're interested in coming to Nashville. I know you liked it here when you were visiting, and you don't have a job yet, and you like crypto, and you want to work remote, and so yeah, why don't you just come to Nashville?" I was like, "Sure, that works." So I went
Hmm.
to Nashville kind of just on like random, full send energy, and
Love that.
then I went with him to a company party, and so that was something that you do need an invite for, right? You can't just
Mm.
crash a company party. But I was roommates with someone at the time, but like again, we built a relationship because I had attended a conference, right? So
Hmm.
like one played into the other, and then I'd already interviewed the CEO of the company, Bitcoin Magazine, on my podcast uh, probably like 3 or 4 months prior,
Hmm.
and that was just organic. That was just reaching out to him on LinkedIn, and he's like, "I'm slammed with the conference, but let's do it after. I'm happy to." And also serendipity, right? Both of those people, the CEO and my friend, both went to the University of Alabama, so there's like a innate
Oh
connection
wow.
there that was very helpful. So a lot of
Yeah.
just random things lining up here, as
Yeah.
did that third friend who was the intern, or who I met through the other internship.
Mm.
Anywho,
Ha- yeah.
yeah.
Continue. Sorry. Continue.
So after crashing the party, I went up to the CEO at the party and was like, hey, like, good to see you. Remember me? I interviewed on my podcast a few months ago." He's like, "Oh yeah, why are you here right now?" And which is a totally fair question, seeing as I didn't work at his company and I was at his company party. And I was like, "Well, I moved in with this guy, and I'm just here." He's like, "Do you have a job?"
Hmm.
I'm like, "No." He's like, "Are you interested in working with us?" I'm like, "Yeah." So he's like, "Go talk to that guy," who was like one of the senior people in charge of hiring people, and then had a formal interview later in the week, and then was there 2 or 3 weeks later, like formally had started.
That's amazing. And that was in Nashville.
That was in Nashville.
Do you? Nashville is like one of the coolest places I've ever visited. I love that place. Do you have a similar feeling to it?
Yeah, I liked it. It got cold in
Yeah, that's fair.
in the winter, and I'm
Coming
from
from a
Las
person who
Vegas.
lives in Las Vegas, yeah.
Yeah, it got cold, and I was like, my job's remote. I don't really need to be here while it's cold.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so then I kind of left because it got cold. But when the
Right.
weather's great, Nashville's awesome. I really liked it.
Yeah. And then that was your position with Bitcoin Magazine, correct?
Hmm.
Okay. And then you're no longer at Bitcoin Magazine.
No longer with Bitcoin Magazine.
Where, how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, so that's another story that's kind of just random serendipitous connections. I had interviewed the CEO of my current company,
Hmm.
and I called it Inflection Points because that's like the name of the company. But
Hmm.
our like public facing brands would be Pomp's Crypto Jobs, Pomp's Crypto Course, which is now the CryptoAcademy.io. Those are more like the public facing products. So I interviewed the CEO of that company, who's not Pomp. That's confusing to a lot of people, but Pomp's not the
Okay.
CEO. I interviewed our CEO and named Colton. Also, last summer, before the Bitcoin conference, my co-host had applied to take the training program and decided not to. But he's like, "The guy running it seems pretty cool. We should talk to him." And
Hmm.
so we interviewed Colton on the podcast, and then I also interviewed Pomp's wife on my podcast, Polina, like
Hmm.
around a similar point in time. And so then when I went to the Bitcoin conference, this was 2021. I met up with Colton, said hi, same thing, right? It's like, well, he was someone I like actually became friends with after the podcast more so than like the CEO of Bitcoin Magazine, just because he and I are the same age versus the Bitcoin Magazine guy's like in his 40s or late
Right.
30s. I don't actually know, but point is we're in similar positions in life. And so I met him at the conference. We hung out. I met Polina and we hung out, and she was with Pomp. We didn't hang out. We like hung out for like a second, just like said
Hmm.
hi. And she was with Pomp at the time, and so like introduced myself to Pomp and like met him. And then kind of serendipitously, just a family friend had of mine, just unrelated, had invested in this new company that Pump's starting with, like the training program and etc. And he's like, "Hey, I know you're happy with your role at Bitcoin Magazine, but I saw this open role there, and I just invested, and like you should consider applying." And since I already had that relationship with Colton when he put us in touch, like I already knew the CEO again, which was really helpful. And then
Hmm.
since I had credibility from already working at Bitcoin Magazine, I was already in the industry, and that was really helpful. And that's kind of how that one came together.
Right. And as a director of growth, what do you do in your day to day, and kind of what's the mission of your job, objective of your job?
Yeah. There's a phrase in crypto, NGU, number go up. That's like kind of a
Mm.
meme. That's like when's Bitcoin gonna get more expensive, right? When's the price gonna go to the moon? So I'm,
Mm-hmm.
basically, director of growth is like you're in charge of NGU, like making the numbers go up. There's a different number that's important every week, right? Some
Mm-hmm.
weeks it's like, well, we have a lot of jobs on our website, and maybe there's too many, so we need to get more people applying to them. And then maybe it's
Mm.
like, well, now there's too many people applying and not enough jobs. It's like go
Right.
find a couple companies and get them on there. Or we also have the trading program. It's like, well, this month we only have this many students, and our goal is to have this many students. How do we get more students next month? It's kind of just tackling whatever number is behind the other numbers and coming up with a project to fix it.
Right.
That's like,
And so
yeah,
for the maybe for, looking back at the last 3 years, and if you were to give yourself a piece of advice coming out of University of Alabama, having just graduated, knowing what you know now, what would it be? And potentially, can that advice be applied to people coming out of college in general? What would it be that you would suggest?
yeah. I think I'm kind of pleased with what I did for the most part. I took like a 3 or 4 month break where I just did my podcast and kind of spent a lot of time thinking about what I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
do. And then, fortunately, like the role kind of once I full sent Nashville, once I was like, okay, I've had enough time thinking. Now I need to go do. Like I think that was
Mm-hmm.
very helpful, and I kind of recommend a similar path to a lot of people. It's like in college you work pretty hard for like 4 years straight, and it's like
Yeah.
you just want a month or two where you have like no obligations. Like you can completely vegetate if that's what you want to do. You can just sit outside in
Mm-hmm.
like the sun for 6 hours and read an entire book in one sitting. Like just like having a couple days or weeks like that, if you are like privileged enough to be able to do that, that's really really helpful. So like a couple periods of like no stress, decompress, just like totally reset. I think that's really constructive. I think mine went on longer than it needed to.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, coming up with as many constraints as you can for what you want to do next. So it's like even if you
Mm.
don't totally know what it is you want to do next, you can probably add some constraints to it, right? So it's like I know the industry I want to work on is crypto, right? That just narrowed down like so many frivolous things I could have applied for, like so many. And I think
Right.
like you mentioned earlier, right? Like finding ways to test the hypothesis is also very helpful for like how to help you come up with that constraint, and then
Mm-hmm.
listing out the types of roles you'd be interested in, right? Just like getting hyper specific about what you want to do. So it's like I could do software, I could do marketing, I could do content in crypto, or I could do like
Mm-hmm.
investment research. Those were like the,
Mm-hmm.
or I could do like sales, but I really didn't know. But I was like, I'm just gonna apply to like roles that match those 5 things. I want something remote, and I want to, really respect the leadership of the company I'm working for. I don't
Yeah.
know if like I don't know if I can offend anyone by saying this as like, and I objectively will not work for any woke company. Like that's not in the
Yeah.
cards for me. That really
Mm-hmm.
narrowed it down quite a bit. So it's like can't be woke company, got to respect the leadership, and has to like be one of these roles in this industry. Then from there is like just starting to once I was taking it seriously, just to go for it. And
Yeah.
basically once you kind of spell out, there's a good book. It's called The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. It's a bit, I don't know if it's actually necessary for people to read that book to like grasp a lot of the key ideas, but
Mm-hmm.
there's certain decisions in life where if you write out, in front of you all the things that you want out of the next step in life, and then if
Mm-hmm.
something is presented to you that's good enough and checks like 9 out of 10 of those boxes, you're kind of silly
Right.
and greedy and delusional to like continue searching.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like
Yeah.
list out everything that you want out of the next step in life, and if like that thing is offered to you, just like take it and be happy. You don't have to like
Totally.
something better could come along, but like I don't know, it's pretty good.
Yeah. I I think I'm 22 and going to be graduating from college this year, and I'm going on this trip right now and doing a little bit of nomad travel because that's something I'm very passionate about, and I'm exploring and trying to build the remote, streams of income and being able to be a little bit independent on the road, financially independent. And I think one of the biggest things that I see in people that I surround myself with at my age, just who are about to graduate from college, is they want so quickly to like get the next thing lined up, even if it means sacrificing what they like want and value in life.
Sure.
And I think that period of like, decompressing and like resting and thinking is so invaluable to like people coming just out of college. And if you have the ability to cultivate that for yourself, you should
It
absolutely
doesn't
take
have to be
advantage of
long.
it. Yeah, it doesn't have to be long. I mean, hell, it could be like an hour. Like you're like, I'm gonna set myself up for an hour, and then
I think
I'm
it needs
just
to be
gonna
longer than an
not do
hour.
anything. Yeah, well, yeah, probably, but
An
um,
hour a day, maybe for like a
yeah,
week.
an hour a
But
day. But I think it's just like it's almost scheduling rest, and one of the basic principles of physiology is like I always tell the kids that I train in the weight room, like all the work that we do in the weight room, it doesn't grow. You don't get stronger unless you rest. Like if you just continue like working out and doing all these things, you're going to actually degrade. You're not going to grow. And scheduling rest is such an important concept in you know becoming elite in athletics, but also finding what you want to do in life, right? Yeah.
absolutely.
So I love that.
I would add like one more piece of like potentially helpful advice that's like I think a lot of your
Mhm,
listeners probably will share like kind of that entrepreneurial ambition, that remote streams of income ambition. And I think for a lot of people that makes getting a job seem unattractive. But I think if you're at a job that is a relatively small team where you're given a ton of various responsibilities and a ton of creative freedom and a ton of leeway to like try different things and learn, I think
mhm,
that in those roles is where you'll encounter problems that will become business like actually good business ideas, right? Because you like find people
mhm.
who are complaining about the same thing, and you like find an opportunity to solve a problem that you're just like unlikely to solve just on a whiteboard. So I think
Right.
for a lot of people, like getting a job with a team you like, where again you respect the leadership, you care about their mission, and you are given like a good variety of opportunities to like do different projects. That's going to be more constructive than like staring at a whiteboard for you're hoping to come up with a business idea.
Sure.
I
Oh
think
yeah, that's
in not all cases, but in many cases.
yeah,
So like
that's
that
a
was something that
fantastic
I
point.
started out with that period of rest, kind of thinking I'm going to stare at a whiteboard this summer and come up with the business I want to start. And then
Hmm.
towards the end of the summer, when I was like, I don't really have any good ideas, or I'm not able to choose any of these ideas, I just need to do something constructive, and then at least I'll have work experience, at least I'll have an income, and then I'm like going to encounter a problem at some point. And that's what happened to my
Yeah.
best friend actually. He got a job with a startup, and while there, just kind of found a problem, and like that's what inspired the business that he later went on to start.
Yeah. That's that's another fantastic piece of advice. Maybe unpacking the remote work right now. Are you traveling a decent amount? Are you still attending a bunch of conferences? Are you going across the country all the time? What does your kind of travel schedule look like?
Yeah, it's been unnecessarily involved for quite a while. So I
Self-imposed?
start. What's that?
Was it self-imposed?
Yes,
Unnecessary?
100%
Yeah.
self-imposed. So I started with Bitcoin Magazine in October.
Hmm.
My first week in Nashville. My first week on the job, I went to New York City for a week and
Hmm.
worked remote from New York City. Then I went to Nashville for like 4 weeks. Then I went home for Thanksgiving to Las Vegas for 4 weeks, and then I went back to Nashville, and at that point had switched to this job. And this is like the amount of weeks is unimportant here, might be off,
Right.
but went back to Nashville, moved out of my apartment, drove to Atlanta for a week, drove to Orlando for a week, drove to Florida for a week, flew back to Las Vegas for 2 months, flew back to Florida for a week, flew back to DC for a few days, went to Ohio for a few days, went to Austin for a few days. Now I've been back here
Hmm.
for like a week. Stay here for another 2 weeks, go to Pennsylvania for a week, go to back to Miami for a week, get my car, and then probably stay on the West Coast for the next 6 months and not travel. But
Nice.
since starting, I've probably not been anywhere for more than 4 weeks very many times.
And maybe a question about while you're on the road, since I'm on the road too now. Uh, what are some things that have enabled you, maybe outside of the finances of it, because obviously you need the monetary support to travel and continue traveling. But what are some things that have enabled you to continue traveling and enjoy traveling?
Mm-hmm. So I'd say one thing, I've stayed in very, very, very few hotel rooms. I've just crashed on like mostly couches and like places with friends and guest rooms. Like I've not spent much on lodging.
Hmm.
And then also since I'm living at home right now and don't live in my place in Nashville, right? That was like a $1,600 a month rent that I'm no longer paying. So it's like you
Hmm.
actually have to rack up quite a bit of frivolous miscellaneous expenses to just catch up to where you were if you're paying rent somewhere. So if you're like
Hmm.
move out of somewhere completely and you're traveling while paying no rent, that's like a pretty good budget boost from like an accounting budget perspective. Um, I was with very different people kind of every time. And so that's really fun. It's like you're hanging out with someone for 4 or 5 days, and then you kind of go on to the next group. I think that keeps the enthusiasm high. And then
Mm-hmm.
having accountability to a job. So if I was doing all that travel while like just doing my own projects and like no specific deadlines, no specific urgency, it'd probably be more difficult to be productive versus like no, I still have like a very clear set of obligations and like there are things that need to get done. And
Mm-hmm.
so like that like forces you to be productive, but then you're motivated to like, you're in some new place, you're only there for 4 days, you want to finish your workday early so you can go and like do the fun things that are unique to that place. Whereas like if you're there for a month, you'd be like, I'll get to it eventually.
Right.
And I mean, still exercising, right? I don't know. That's like pretty straightforward advice, but also like I think one thing I haven't been drinking this whole year, like alcohol this whole year at all, and I think that's really
Mm-hmm.
helpful to like that just can kill a few days. It's like you're sleeping on
Mm-hmm.
someone else's mattress. You don't recognize it. It's like an unfamiliar environment. Like your whole routines are off, and you're hungover. Like that would be too. I couldn't handle that. That'd be way too much. But if you're like
Right.
sober and you're not getting hangovers, that also is like a big energy boost.
Totally. Yeah. One question on you kind of hinted on it, but the jobs that allow you the flexibility to potentially like end the workday early if you're able to get the work done, quality work done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I see that as like such a plus
Mm-hmm.
for those specific remote jobs. Are there ways? Do you like? Was that something that you valued when you were considering this position that you were in now at the onset, or
Mm-hmm.
did you just kind of come across it?
No, I mean this team was very straightforward at the beginning. That's we're results oriented,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something I look for. I've been in hours based environments before and definitely prefer to not be beholden to that structure. It's like if I can just work with like, a monstrous amount of focus from 6 a.m. to noon or like 7
Yeah.
a.m. to 11 a.m., just like literally 4 hours of unbroken conversation, like concentration, then like hit one or two afternoon meetings, like it's results oriented. So that was very
Yeah.
important to me up front because I think the incentive structure is right. That's like another whole thing in like the crypto world is like incentive structures. But when you're motivated to work as quickly and effectively as possible because you can end your day and have fun once you're done. That's way
Yeah.
better than like you need to fill 9 hours of desk time. So it's like, well, I'm just
Yeah.
gonna my incentive is to then figure out how to keep myself entertained for 9 hours while doing just enough. So
I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and informing me about all the exciting things. I think one thing that I've gathered from this conversation is just one of the things I absolutely love about talking with people is you kind of gain insight into their how they think about things, and like you touched on this briefly at the beginning, but talking with high charisma people, and you said that there was just kind of like a potent population of those people within crypto. I talk about building environments, surrounding yourself with people that reciprocate what you want to be, and that high charisma aspect I absolutely love. And so thank you for your high charisma and your
thank you.
willingness to take the time and inform us all about the world of cryptocurrency. And maybe to close up, you could just point people to where they can find you and anywhere else you'd like to point people to.
Yeah, if people are interested in kind of knowing what's up in my world, my Twitter account has links to the YouTube and the podcast, the YouTube channel for the podcast. I do write a newsletter, not super often. I'm like 11 weeks behind, which is a lot of weeks. But you don't have to hear from me every week either. You know what I mean? If I just send you
Mm-hmm.
like a summary, we're all saving time. But if you follow me on Twitter or on Instagram, I'll eventually get those places up to date, or you could find your way to the most active channel. But my podcast is the Lewis and Kyle Show. It's just easy to look up Lewis Shulman on Twitter or on Google and see whatever comes up and just follow the rabbit hole. But no specific asks, just do your thing, people.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you.